You're running, not just from a situation, but from everything you thought you knew about your life. You've been mistreated, cast out, and left to fend for yourself in a desolate, scorching wilderness. No one's chasing you, but that's almost worse because it means no one cares that you're gone. That's where Hagar found herself, on the run from the people who were supposed to protect her, carrying a child, and believing there was no way out of this mess. But what if I told you that this is where the story really begins? That this isn't just about a woman lost in the wilderness, but about a divine encounter that would change her life forever. It's not just a journey through sand and heat, it's a journey into the heart of what it means to be seen, heard, and cared for by God Himself. Stay with me, because this isn't just Hagar's story, it's your story. It's a story about what happens when you're at your lowest, when you think you've been abandoned by the people you trusted, and just when you're ready to give up. You find out that someone has been watching over you all along. This story isn't just about survival in the desert, it's about discovering that even when you feel like an outcast, even when life seems to have tossed you aside, God's eyes are on you. We'll explore the tension, the heartbreak, and the jealousy that led Hagar to this moment. But more importantly, we'll unravel the miraculous encounter that turned everything around. A story where God didn't wait for Hagar to make her way back, He met her in her wilderness. And when He showed up, He didn't just give her a pep talk. He gave her a promise, one that would echo through the generations and reveal a side of God's heart that we all need to understand. Sound like a journey you want to take? Stay tuned, because Hagar's wilderness walk holds some shocking revelations, not just for her, but for you. You might just discover that your darkest moments are where God is most present, and that when all seems lost, He's already preparing a well of hope, just waiting for you to see it. Keep watching, because this story is about to reveal something unexpected, something life-changing. Imagine yourself standing in the middle of a vast desert. The sun is merciless, beating down on you with a heat so intense it feels like it could melt the very sand beneath your feet. You're thirsty, exhausted, and completely alone. There's no shelter in sight, no friendly face, no oasis to quench your thirst. It's just you, the scorching sun, and the sound of your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. Now imagine that this isn't just a moment in time, but your entire reality. This is where Hagar found herself, cast out, unwanted, wandering through the wilderness, not knowing where she was headed or if she'd even survive. But before we get too deep into the desert, let's rewind. Who was Hagar? To understand her story, we have to go back to where it all began, Egypt. Hagar was an Egyptian slave, a woman with no real power, no real status. She belonged to Sarah, Abraham's wife, and in a twist of fate that only ancient history could deliver, Hagar was caught up in a plan that wasn't her own. Sarah, in her desperation to have a child, gave Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate. And just like that, Hagar's life became intertwined with one of the most significant families in biblical history. Now let's pause for a second and think about that. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Hagar? One day she's serving in Sarah's household, and the next she's being handed over to Abraham to bear a child that wasn't hers by choice. It's like being thrown into a soap opera you didn't ask to be a part of. And to make it worse, she wasn't just a minor character. She was now in the center of it all. But unlike Abraham and Sarah, Hagar didn't have the luxury of choice. She couldn't say no. She couldn't walk away. What started as Sarah's plan quickly unraveled. Hagar became pregnant, and suddenly the dynamics in the household shifted. The tension between her and Sarah was like a slow-boiling pot ready to spill over. Picture it, two women both vying for a place in the heart of the same man. Hagar was carrying the child, the future of the family, but Sarah was still the wife. It was an awkward, messy situation that was destined to explode. It's like when you're stuck in the world's most uncomfortable family dinner, but there's no escape and the stakes are incredibly high. At first, Hagar might have felt a sense of triumph. Here she was, pregnant with Abraham's child, something Sarah had longed for but couldn't achieve. But pride mixed with jealousy can create a toxic cocktail. Sarah's resentment grew, and soon the tension in the house became unbearable. It didn't take long before Hagar, once the lowly servant, became the object of Sarah's scorn and mistreatment. So what does Hagar do? She runs. She flees into the desert, probably thinking she'd rather face the harshness of the wilderness than the cruelty of Sarah. But running away doesn't make the desert any less dangerous. Can you see her now? A young woman alone in a vast wilderness, the sun scorching her skin, her throat dry, her heart pounding with fear. She's pregnant, vulnerable, and unsure of what to do next. It's a picture of desperation that's all too relatable, even in today's world. How many times have you wanted to run away from something? Maybe it wasn't a physical desert, but perhaps you faced a personal wilderness of your own, a place where you felt lost, abandoned, and completely alone. Hagar's flight into the wilderness represents that deep human instinct to escape when life becomes too much. We've all been there, when the pressure, the tension, or the heartache becomes so overwhelming that you think, I just need to get away. But often, like Hagar, we run straight into the unknown, without a plan, without a way out. Hagar's story reminds us that even when we feel like outcasts, alone in the desert, God is still watching. He sees us. The Bible tells us that in her moment of desperation, Hagar encounters the angel of the Lord. And what's even more beautiful about this moment is that it happens not in a palace or a place of importance, but in the middle of nowhere. God doesn't wait for Hagar to come back to civilization. He meets her in the wilderness, right where she is. But can you imagine Hagar's surprise? Here she is, probably expecting nothing more than to collapse from exhaustion or thirst, and instead, she's met by a divine messenger. It's like expecting a traffic ticket but getting a letter that says, "You've won the lottery." It's unexpected, it's life-changing, and it's exactly what she needed at that moment. And the angel's message? It's one of hope, one of promise. God sees her. God hears her cries. She is not invisible, and neither is her child. Her son will be named Ishmael, which means God hears. Think about that for a second. A woman who was an outcast, someone who had been treated as disposable, is now being told that not only does God see her, but He has a plan for her and her son. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how lost or unseen we feel, we are never beyond God's sight. So what's next for Hagar? Does she go back, or does she stay in the desert, hoping for something else? Well, that's where the story takes a turn, and it's one that might surprise you. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. There's still so much more to unpack about Hagar's incredible journey and what it means for each of us. But before we continue, ask yourself, how many times have you felt like Hagar? Have you ever found yourself in a place where you thought no one could possibly see or care about your struggles? If so, stick with me, because Hagar's story is about to show us just how far God will go to care for those who feel forgotten. Now let's step back into the story, but this time, let's zoom in on the complicated dynamic between Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham. It's a tale that feels less like ancient history and more like a modern drama where family tension, unmet expectations, and conflicting emotions run wild. If Netflix had been around back then, you can bet this story would have been the top trending series. First, let's talk about Sarah. Picture her, a woman who has spent her entire life waiting for a child. She's heard the promise from God that Abraham would be the father of nations. But here she is, year after year, with nothing to show for it. I mean, the clock is ticking and the pressure is mounting. You can almost feel her frustration, right? She's likely tired of hearing, "Oh, the Lord will provide," while looking around at all the other families with their kids, wondering when her turn will come. And in her desperation, Sarah takes matters into her own hands. Now enter Hagar. She's young, Egyptian, and a servant in Sarah's household. Sarah sees Hagar not as a person, but as a solution. Here, Sarah says to Abraham, "Take Hagar and have a child with her. Maybe this is how God will fulfill His promise." Now, Abraham, for all his greatness, doesn't exactly argue. He goes along with the plan, and suddenly Hagar finds herself in a situation she never asked for. Can you imagine how Hagar must have felt? One day she's fetching water and sweeping the floors, and the next she's thrust into the most awkward love triangle ever. But wait, it gets even more complicated. Once Hagar becomes pregnant, the dynamic shifts. She's no longer just a servant. She's the woman carrying Abraham's child, the future of the promise. And here's where things really get interesting. Hagar understandably starts to feel a bit superior. She's carrying the child that Sarah could never have, and it's not long before pride sneaks in. Suddenly, Hagar is walking around with a new attitude. Picture it. She's no longer just the help. Now she's strolling through the household with her hand resting on her pregnant belly, maybe even throwing a side eye at Sarah every once in a while, as if to say, "Look who's indispensable now." But Sarah? Oh, she's fuming. Her plan has backfired in the worst way. She thought giving Hagar to Abraham would solve her problem, but now it's only made things worse. You can almost hear the tension crackling in the air every time they're in the same room. It's like when you've had a falling out with someone at work and you're both sitting at the same meeting, pretending not to notice each other, but the awkwardness is practically tangible. Now imagine that tension, but multiply it by about 1,000, because this isn't just a workplace spat. This is a household power struggle. Sarah's jealousy begins to grow. Every glance Hagar throws her way feels like a taunt, and Sarah's resentment bubbles over. She goes to Abraham and says, "This is your fault. Look at how she's treating me. I'm the one who's supposed to be your wife." But she's acting like she owns the place. And here's the kicker. Abraham, trying to keep the peace, throws his hands up and says, "Do whatever you think is best. She's your servant." It's the ultimate pass the buck move, right? You can almost see him stepping back slowly like, "Yeah, I'm gonna let you two sort this one out." But let's be real. This whole situation feels a little too familiar, doesn't it? We've all seen this kind of dynamic play out in our own lives. Maybe not with surrogates and ancient patriarchs, but we've all been in those situations where people's insecurities, pride, and jealousy create tension. Whether it's the workplace, family gatherings, or even friendships, these emotions play out again and again. Maybe you've been in Sarah's shoes, watching someone else succeed where you've struggled, and feeling that sting of jealousy. Or maybe you've been Hagar, finding yourself thrust into a position of power and not knowing how to navigate it without letting pride get the best of you. And let's throw in a little humor here. Picture Hagar at the ancient version of a family reunion, sitting awkwardly across from Sarah at the dinner table. Every glance, every movement is loaded with tension. The atmosphere is so thick, you could slice it with a knife. It's like when you're trying to avoid eye contact with the one relative you've been feuding with over who gets grandma's old armchair. Only instead of an armchair, it's the future of an entire nation at stake. No big deal, right? But here's the thing. This isn't just about personal drama. This is about God's bigger plan. While Sarah and Hagar are caught up in their power struggle, God is still at work behind the scenes, weaving their stories into his grand design. Both women are crucial to the fulfillment of God's promises, even if they can't see it in the heat of their conflict. And let's not forget, Sarah's jealousy leads to more than just dirty looks and tension-filled dinners. She begins to mistreat Hagar. The Bible doesn't give us the details, but you can imagine the way Sarah's frustration played out. Maybe it was harsh words, cold shoulders, or an increased workload. Whatever it was, it became unbearable for Hagar, and she did what so many of us do when the pressure becomes too much. She ran. She fled into the desert, alone and afraid. But even in her flight, God had not abandoned her. This is where Hagar's story takes a powerful turn. But before we get there, think about what just happened. Here's a woman who found herself in a situation she never asked for. And when things got tough, she did what felt natural. She ran. How many times have we found ourselves running from difficult situations because it feels like the only option left? Hagar's story isn't just an ancient tale, it's our story too. It's the story of running away when life becomes too hard, too messy, too painful. But as we'll soon see, God doesn't leave us in our desert places. He sees us, even when we feel invisible. And for Hagar, her desert journey is about to take a surprising turn, one that will change everything. So stick with me, because what happens next in Hagar's story is something we can all relate to on a deeply personal level. So here we are with Hagar, alone, pregnant, and running into the wilderness. Can you picture it? The dry desert air stinging her eyes, the endless stretch of sand in every direction, and nothing but her thoughts to keep her company. If this were a modern movie, this would be the part where the camera zooms out, showing just how small and vulnerable Hagar is against the vast emptiness. She's not just physically alone, she's emotionally isolated, rejected by the very people who were supposed to protect her. It's the ultimate low point, and it's easy to imagine her wondering, does anyone even see me? Does anyone care? Hagar's flight into the wilderness was driven by sheer desperation. Sarah's mistreatment became unbearable, and honestly, can you blame her for running? Sarah had gone from being Hagar's mistress to her tormentor. And let's not forget, Sarah's impatience with God is what led to this whole situation in the first place. Sarah didn't want to wait for God's timing, so she took matters into her own hands, thrusting Hagar into a life she never chose. And here we are, thousands of years later, still seeing the impact of that decision. Now here's where it gets interesting. Sarah's impatience didn't just cause a rift in her household, it essentially created two of the world's largest religious movements, Christianity and Islam. Think about it. Hagar's son, Ishmael, is considered the father of the Arab nations, from which Islam emerged. Meanwhile, Sarah eventually gives birth to Isaac, through whom the Jewish people, and later Christianity, are traced. One act of impatience, one decision to step outside of God's plan, and the world was forever changed. It's wild, isn't it? It's like a ripple effect, where one small stone thrown into the water sends waves across history. But let's get back to Hagar in the desert. She's probably terrified, pregnant, tired, and with no clear direction. You can almost hear the doubts swirling in her mind, right? What now? Where am I supposed to go? Will anyone help me? It's a familiar feeling, isn't it? We've all had moments where we felt completely lost, as though no one is paying attention to the struggles we're going through. Maybe it's after a job loss, a painful breakup, or a tough season in life where everything seems to be falling apart. You feel unseen, unheard, and completely overwhelmed by the weight of it all. And in those moments, it's easy to ask, can God really see me? Does he even know where I am? That's exactly where Hagar found herself, wondering if anyone, including God, cared about her fate. It's in these moments of deep vulnerability that we often feel the most alone, isn't it? The wilderness represents that space between where we were and where we're supposed to go. And let's be honest, it's a scary place. But here's the thing, even in the wilderness, God sees us. In Genesis 16, as Hagar is sitting by a spring, the angel of the Lord appears to her. And here's where it gets really beautiful. God didn't wait for Hagar to come back to civilization. He didn't wait for her to have it all together. He met her right where she was, alone, scared, and broken. It's a moment that changes everything. Can you imagine the relief she must have felt? One second, she's convinced she's completely alone in the world. And the next, God shows up. It's like the moment in a movie when the hero comes in at the last possible second to save the day. Hagar's life was spiraling out of control, but God stepped in. He saw her. He heard her cries. And that's where we get the incredible name for God, El Roi, the God who sees. It's not just that he's aware of what's going on from a distance, he's actively involved. He steps into the mess, into the pain, and brings hope. So what does God tell Hagar? He doesn't give her some sugar-coated promise that everything will be easy. No, he tells her to go back. That's right, back to Sarah, back to the situation that drove her to flee in the first place. But this time, she's not going back as the same person. God promises her that he has a plan for her son, Ishmael, and that he will become the father of a great nation. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about purpose. God doesn't just see Hagar's struggle. He has a plan for her future. And here's where it hits home for us. How many times have we run from something, convinced that there's no way out, only to find that God meets us in our wilderness? Maybe it's not an angel at a spring, but a word of encouragement from a friend, a breakthrough after months of hardship, or a moment of clarity when everything seemed foggy. It's that undeniable sense that, yes, God does see us. He's not indifferent to our pain, and he's working behind the scenes, even when it feels like we're all alone in the desert. But let's bring in a little humor to keep things light. Imagine Hagar sitting there by the spring, minding her own business, when suddenly the angel appears. Her first reaction might have been, "Really? Now you show up?" It's like when you've been trying to fix something for hours and someone swoops in at the last second with the perfect solution. You're grateful, but you also can't help but think, "Where were you 3 hours ago?" But that's the beauty of it. God's timing isn't always our timing, but it's perfect. Hagar's story is a reminder that even when we're running, even when we feel abandoned or unseen, God is right there, waiting to reveal himself in ways we never expected. And for Hagar, this moment was life-changing. So what will become of her now? Will she go back to face Sarah and Abraham? Can God's promise really be enough to give her the strength to return? It's a turning point not just in Hagar's life, but in the grand story that's still unfolding. And as we dive deeper into her journey, we'll discover how her faith in the God who sees transformed not just her life, but the lives of generations to come. Stick with me, because this is where things really start to get interesting. There she was, Hagar, sitting by that desert spring, probably wondering what was next for her. Alone, exhausted, and likely feeling more than a little bit lost, she was far from the life she knew, far from the home of Abraham and Sarah, far from any real sense of safety or belonging. It must have felt like the end of the line. And honestly, who could blame her for feeling that way? Running away seemed like the only option. But now she was stuck in the wilderness with no plan, no hope. Can you imagine? No one else around, just the sound of wind rustling through the barren landscape, her stomach growling, and her mind racing with doubt. I bet at that moment Hagar would have given anything to see a sign of hope. Maybe she was even starting to see things, like one of those classic desert mirages, you know? A distant palm tree, shimmering water, and maybe a couple of camels just hanging out. Like a mirage version of a Starbucks popping up in the middle of nowhere. But this was no mirage. Out of nowhere, an angel. Not just any angel, but the angel of the Lord appears, right there in her wilderness. Let's be real. Hagar probably wasn't expecting that. I mean, talk about a plot twist. You're expecting to maybe collapse from heat exhaustion, and instead, God himself sends an angel to meet you. Let's pause and really sit with that for a second. Here's Hagar, someone who's been cast aside, someone who probably felt completely invisible. She's just a servant, right? In the grand scheme of things, why would God care about her? And yet, here he is, showing up when she needs him the most. Have you ever felt like that? Like you were just one more person in the crowd, dealing with your own private struggles, thinking, there's no way God is paying attention to me, not with all the other things going on in the world. And then, boom, he shows up in a way that you never expected. Maybe it wasn't an angel standing in front of you, but maybe it was that unexpected word of encouragement from a friend at the exact moment you needed it. Or a message in church that spoke so directly to your heart, it felt like God was talking straight to you. I remember a time in my life when I was dealing with something that felt too big for me to handle. It was one of those wilderness moments, you know what I mean? Nothing was going right, and it felt like every door I tried to open was slamming shut. I was starting to feel like, God, are you even out there? Can you even see what I'm going through? And then, out of nowhere, I had this encounter. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, but someone I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to me with exactly the encouragement I needed. It was like God tapped them on the shoulder and said, hey, go remind this person that I haven't forgotten about them. It was one of those moments where you think, all right, God, you got me. You're here. You're still paying attention. And that's what happened to Hagar. God saw her. In Genesis 16, the angel calls her by name. By name. He doesn't say, hey, you servant girl. He says, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? Can you imagine the shock she must have felt? She's in the middle of nowhere, thinking she's completely abandoned, and here comes this angel who knows exactly who she is. He doesn't just see her, he knows her story. He knows her pain, her struggle, her heartache. And he doesn't scold her for running away either. No, why did you leave, Hagar? How could you? Instead, he asks her where she's been and where she's going, like he's inviting her to tell her story, to share her pain. Now let's add a little humor here. Can you imagine Hagar's reaction? She might have been sitting there thinking, wait, what? Who are you and how do you know my name? This wasn't exactly the desert customer service I was expecting. She's probably looking around like, am I dreaming? Is this real? I was expecting a snake or, I don't know, more sand. An angel, really. And what's even more amazing is that the angel doesn't just offer her comfort. He gives her a promise. He tells her to go back to Sarah, which, let's be real, probably wasn't the news Hagar wanted to hear. But with the promise that God has seen her and he has a plan for her and her son, Ishmael. Ishmael, the name means God hears. The angel is literally telling her, hey Hagar, God hears you. Your cries didn't go unnoticed. You and your son matter. That's huge. Here's this woman who has spent her life feeling insignificant, feeling like she was just a part of someone else's story, and God shows up to tell her that she's part of his own story. How many times do we need that reminder? We think, oh, well, I'm just another person just going through the motions, but God's over here saying, nope, I see you, I hear you, you're part of my plan. I wonder if Hagar sat there, letting the angel's words sink in and just breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. I mean, what would you do if in your darkest moment, someone showed up and told you that God not only saw you, but that he had a purpose for you? It's like that moment when you've been carrying a heavy load for so long that you don't even realize how weighed down you are. And someone finally says, you can let go now. And the weight just lifts. And for Hagar, that's exactly what happened. The moment she realizes that she's not forgotten, not abandoned, it changes everything. She calls God El Roi, which means the God who sees me. That's who God is, the one who sees us in our mess, in our wilderness moments, and meets us right there. So, what does she do next? Well, you'll see. Her story is far from over, and trust me, it's about to get even more powerful. But for now, just sit with this idea. God sees you even when you feel invisible. He hears your cries, even when you think no one is listening. And he has a purpose for you, even when life feels like nothing more than chaos. So, there's Hagar sitting by the spring, hearing the words that would change her entire outlook. The angel of the Lord had just delivered a message straight from God himself. She wasn't alone, she wasn't forgotten, and her son, the child she was carrying, would have a future. A big future. Can you imagine the relief that must have flooded her at that moment? After running through the desert, feeling utterly lost and rejected, to now hearing that God not only saw her but had a plan for her and her unborn child? Talk about a complete 180. Let's take a second to really think about this. The angel tells Hagar that her son would be named Ishmael, meaning God hears. How powerful is that? The name itself is a constant reminder that God heard her cries, even in the wilderness, even when she thought no one else did. And this wasn't just a comforting pat on the back. This was a promise. God was telling her, you think this is the end of the road, but it's only the beginning. It's kind of like when you think a door has slammed shut in your face, and suddenly someone opens a window and says, hey, look, there's a whole new view out here. But let's be real for a moment. Imagine Hagar's thoughts before this divine encounter. She probably assumed that she and her son were going to be nothing more than a sad footnote in someone else's story. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're just playing a bit part in someone else's grand drama? Maybe it's at work, in relationships, or even in your family dynamics. You feel invisible, like what you want, what you need, somehow doesn't matter in the bigger picture. And yet here comes God, showing up to remind Hagar and us that he sees, he hears, and he's got a plan that's so much bigger than what we can see in our moments of despair. And here's the kicker. God's promise to Hagar wasn't just some small consolation prize. It was huge. He told her that her son would be the father of a great nation. This wasn't just about survival, it was about legacy. Ishmael's descendants would become a vast people. And while his story would later intersect with Isaac's, and the paths of their descendants would diverge, the promise to Hagar remained firm. God had a plan for her and her son, even though their lives had been marked by rejection and displacement. Now let's bring it into today's world. How often do we feel like Hagar, lost, rejected, or outcast? It happens all the time, whether it's being sidelined at work, feeling abandoned in a relationship, or being overlooked in our own families. We all have moments where we feel like we're sitting by that spring, wondering if anyone notices, if anyone cares. But just like God heard Hagar's cries, He hears ours too. He listens when we feel invisible, and He responds. It might not always be in the way we expect or in the timing we want, but His promise remains. He hears us. And I think of stories I've heard from people who've been through those wilderness moments. One friend, for example, went through a season of job loss and rejection. Every door seemed to slam in his face, and he started feeling like maybe his skills, his dreams, just didn't matter. It's like the world had told him, "We don't need you." But in the midst of that, he found a completely different calling, something that aligned with his true passions. He's now in a place where he's thriving. But back then, he felt like Hagar in the desert, forgotten, left out. Or take the story of a woman I know who went through a painful divorce. She felt utterly abandoned and questioned if she'd ever find happiness again. But through that pain, she rediscovered herself, built new friendships, and started using her experience to help other women going through similar struggles. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but in her most broken moments, God was still working. He saw her pain, heard her cries, and brought her through to something more meaningful than she ever imagined. Hagar's story is for all of us who've ever felt cast aside. It's for the people who feel like their cries are going unheard in a world that's too busy or too noisy. It's a reminder that God's care for the outcast isn't just a theme in ancient stories. It's real, it's now, and it's personal. The beauty of God's promise to Hagar is that it was a direct response to her cries of distress. He didn't show up with a vague, "Don't worry, things will get better." No, He showed up with specifics. He told her, "I hear you. Your son will be Ishmael, because I hear." It was a name that Hagar could hold on to, something she could tell her son as he grew. "You were named because God hears us." Can you imagine the strength that gave her, knowing that even in her lowest moment, God had already written her son's future into His plan? And let's be honest, this moment between Hagar and God isn't just about her. It's about all of us. It's about how God enters our stories when we least expect it. We might be trudging through our own wilderness, thinking we're all alone, and God shows up with a promise that shifts everything. He says, "I see you, I hear you, I've got you." As we reflect on Hagar's journey, let it be a reminder to all of us that no matter how far into the wilderness we've wandered, God hears. Whether it's the quiet, whispered prayers in the dead of night or the desperate cries when everything feels too overwhelming, He listens. He cares. And just like He had a plan for Hagar, He's got one for each of us, too. The key is trusting that even when we feel like outcasts, we are never out of His sight. So what happens next for Hagar? How does she carry this promise back into her life with Sarah and Abraham? And how does God continue to shape her story? Stick with me, because her journey, like so many of ours, is far from over. So after this incredible encounter with the angel of the Lord, Hagar now faces the reality of returning to the very place she had fled from. I mean, let's be real, this is no small thing. She has to go back to Sarah, the woman who mistreated her, the woman she had tried to escape from. It's like walking back into a situation you were convinced you had left behind for good, like showing up at the office on a Monday morning after you dramatically quit on Friday. There's no way it wasn't awkward. You know she must have been thinking, well, here goes nothing. But this time, Hagar isn't walking back defeated or broken. She's going back with a renewed sense of purpose, hope, and most importantly, a promise from God. That makes all the difference, doesn't it? When you know you're not walking into a situation alone, when you've got the assurance that God is with you, everything changes. You can walk into places that once filled you with fear, knowing that you're not the same person who left. Hagar, who once ran away out of desperation, was now walking back with courage. I imagine her taking a deep breath as she approaches Sarah's tent, holding her head just a little higher than before. And let's talk about the courage it took for Hagar to face Sarah. She didn't have to go back. She could have stayed in the wilderness, far away from the tension, the jealousy, and the mistreatment. But God told her to return, and because she trusted His promise, she had the strength to obey. Can you relate to that? Have you ever had to return to a tough situation? Not because it was easy, but because you knew deep down it was the right thing to do? It's that feeling of walking back into a room where you once felt humiliated, only now you've grown, you've changed, and you know that the situation doesn't have the same power over you anymore. For Hagar, this wasn't just a physical return, it was a spiritual one. She was going back with the knowledge that God had a plan for her and her son. And sure, facing Sarah probably still came with a whole lot of tension. I like to imagine her first day back. Maybe she walks into the tent, and there's Sarah giving her that look, the one that says, "I'm still not over this." And Hagar, knowing what she knows now, just gives a small smile and thinks, "Yep, this is going to be interesting." But isn't that life? We have these moments where we have to face the people or situations that once made us feel small, that once made us run. It's never easy, but when you go back with the knowledge that God is in control, it changes the dynamic completely. You're no longer just reacting to the situation, you're walking into it with intention, with purpose. Let's bring in some personal connection here. I remember a time in my own life when I had to face a situation I desperately wanted to avoid. I had left a toxic work environment thinking, well, that chapter is closed forever. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. A few years later, I found myself back in the same industry, working alongside some of the same people. At first, I felt that familiar dread creeping in, like, here we go again. But this time I was different. God had brought me through some things, and I knew I wasn't the same person who had left. Walking back in, I had a sense of peace, like, I've got this. God's got this. And sure enough, it wasn't easy, but I walked with a sense of strength I didn't have before. For Hagar, her return to Abraham and Sarah wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. She had a promise from God, and that promise gave her the confidence to face whatever was ahead. Sarah might still have her issues, and Abraham might still be caught in the middle. But Hagar had something neither of them had, a direct encounter with God, a promise of hope and a future. And let's not forget, Hagar was pregnant. That means every day she was carrying a literal reminder of God's promise with her. With every kick, every movement, she was reminded that God had not forgotten her, that Ishmael's name would be a testament to His faithfulness. Can you imagine her talking to her unborn child, saying, "You have no idea how special you are. God sees you. He hears us. You've got a future ahead of you, my little Ishmael?" It's the kind of comfort that doesn't just settle in the heart, it strengthens the soul. But back to the camp, where the reality of life would have set in quickly. We don't know all the details of how Hagar's return played out day by day, but we can imagine it wasn't all smooth sailing. Sarah's jealousy probably didn't just disappear overnight. I can picture the sideways glances, the tense silences, maybe even a few cutting remarks. But Hagar, this time she wasn't running. This time, she was standing her ground, not because she was defiant, but because she was assured. God had spoken to her, and that gave her the courage to keep going. Here's the thing, returning to difficult situations doesn't mean they magically get easier. Sometimes the tension remains. The circumstances don't immediately change, but you change. God doesn't always take us out of the tough places, but He strengthens us to face them. And that's what makes all the difference. So as Hagar settled back into life with Abraham and Sarah, she did so with the confidence that came from her encounter with God. She wasn't the same woman who had fled into the wilderness. She had faced her fears, and now she was walking in the truth of God's promise. The future wasn't fully clear yet, but it was bright. And that hope, that's what carried her forward. And the best part? That same strength is available to us. Every time we face situations we'd rather run from, we can remember Hagar's story, the story of a woman who returned, not because it was easy, but because God had given her a promise. And that promise was more powerful than any fear she had. We too can walk back into tough places, knowing that God goes with us. And just like Hagar, we can face whatever comes next with courage and hope. As time passed, the story of Hagar's son, Ishmael, and Sarah's eventual son, Isaac, began to unfold. And what a story it turned out to be. If you thought things were tense between Sarah and Hagar, just wait until you throw two brothers into the mix. Sibling rivalry? Oh, it's about to get real. You've got Ishmael, who was the firstborn, growing up as the only son in Abraham's household for many years. And then, out of nowhere, Isaac comes along, the long-awaited promised child. You can already feel the tension building, right? Imagine Ishmael's confusion. He'd been living his whole life with the understanding that he was Abraham's son, the one carrying the legacy. And then suddenly, he's not the only kid in town anymore. Isaac's birth must have shifted the entire dynamic in the household. Ishmael was a teenager by this point, and let's face it, teenagers are already dealing with enough identity struggles without having to share the spotlight with a baby brother who everyone is calling the miracle child. You can picture the eye rolls, can't you? Every time someone gushed over Isaac, you just know Ishmael was in the background thinking, "Oh great, here we go again." The Bible tells us in Genesis 21 that there was a moment where Ishmael was caught mocking Isaac during a celebration for Isaac's weaning. Now, what exactly he was mocking, we don't know, but can you blame him? He was probably feeling pushed aside, like everything he had known was being taken from him. It's the classic older sibling reaction to the new baby. Except, in this case, it wasn't just about sharing toys. It was about identity, about inheritance, and about who would carry on Abraham's line. That's some serious sibling rivalry right there. Let's be honest, though, this tension is something most of us can relate to. If you have siblings, you've probably experienced those moments of rivalry, right? Maybe it wasn't about who would inherit a family fortune or fulfill a divine promise, but it might have been over something just as important to a child, like who got the bigger slice of cake or the best seat in the car. And, oh, let's not forget the "I'm mom's favorite" argument that never really goes away. Families are messy, and the tension between Ishmael and Isaac is just a biblical-level example of what we still see today. Now let's talk about Sarah for a second. Once Isaac was born, her whole perspective changed. She was fiercely protective of her son and probably felt like Ishmael was a threat to Isaac's future. After all, in her eyes, Isaac was the promised one. But here's where the story gets even more complicated. Sarah, feeling threatened by Ishmael's presence, told Abraham that both Hagar and Ishmael had to go. That's right. After all those years, after all the promises and the return to their household, Sarah decided it was time to kick them out. Can you imagine the scene? It's like one of those intense family meetings where tensions are high, and someone makes a drastic decision that nobody saw coming. Except in this case, it wasn't about who forgot to take out the trash. It was about sending a mother and child into the wilderness. And here's where we see God's heart again. Even though Isaac was the child through whom the promise would be fulfilled, God didn't abandon Ishmael. When Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, God still provided for them. He met them in their need, just like he had done before. Genesis 21:17 tells us that God heard Ishmael's cries. Once again, God reminded Hagar that Ishmael would also become a great nation. Even though Ishmael wasn't the chosen one in terms of the covenant with Abraham, God still had a plan and purpose for his life. That's a powerful reminder that God's love isn't limited to a select few. He cares for the overlooked and the cast aside, just as much as he cares for those who seem to be at the center of the story. It's easy to see ourselves in Ishmael's shoes sometimes, isn't it? We can all relate to moments where we feel pushed aside, like we're not the main character in our own story. Maybe at work, in our families, or even in friendships, it can feel like we're the ones left out of the spotlight, overshadowed by someone else's success or favor. But Ishmael's story is a reminder that just because someone else seems to be the chosen one, doesn't mean that God has forgotten about us. God's plans are never limited to just one path. He works through every life, every story, in ways that we might not always see in the moment. And let's not forget, despite the tension between the brothers, they eventually came together to bury their father Abraham. That moment speaks volumes, doesn't it? Despite the rivalry, despite the tension and hurt, there was still something that united them. It's a reminder that even the most strained family relationships can find moments of reconciliation, even if it's later down the line. Now back to Ishmael and Isaac. This sibling rivalry was no ordinary competition over who got the best room in the tent. It was about inheritance, identity, and legacy. But what's incredible is that God's care for both boys never wavered. Isaac was the chosen one, yes, but Ishmael was not forgotten. He had a destiny of his own. This is a powerful reflection of God's character. His love and care extend beyond human hierarchies and chosen lines. He doesn't just reserve his blessings for the first or the favorite. God cares for all his children, even those who feel overlooked. We see this in our own families and relationships, don't we? Maybe you've experienced the tension of feeling like someone else is getting all the attention or all the opportunities, and it seems like you've been forgotten. But Ishmael's story shows us that God's love is far-reaching, encompassing everyone, even those who feel like they've been pushed to the sidelines. At the end of the day, whether you're an Ishmael feeling overlooked or an Isaac carrying the weight of expectation, God's love and purpose are woven into each of our stories. The rivalry between the two brothers reminds us that God's plan is bigger than family squabbles, jealousy, or competition. He has room for all of us in his story, and his care reaches us no matter where we stand. And here we are again, with Hagar on her second journey into the wilderness. You'd think one trip through the desert would be enough for anyone, right? But no, here she is, once again walking into the unknown, this time with her teenage son, Ishmael, by her side. This wasn't a road trip. This was a banishment. Sarah had finally had enough. The sibling rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac had crossed a line, and Sarah wasn't going to have it anymore. So she demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away for good. Now let's pause for a second. Can you imagine Abraham in that moment? He must have been torn. On one hand, he loved Isaac, the promised child, but Ishmael was still his son, his flesh and blood. Sending them away couldn't have been easy, but the tension in the household was undeniable, and Sarah was determined. So early one morning, Abraham gave Hagar some food and water, and off they went, into the wilderness. Again. Can you imagine how Hagar must have felt? It's déjà vu, but this time, she's not alone. She's got Ishmael with her. I'm sure she was trying to be strong for him, but inside she must have been panicking. They're wandering in the heat with nothing but a little bread and water, and it's not long before the supplies run out. And then the reality of their situation hits her. They're in the middle of nowhere. No shelter, no food, and no water. The tension rises. You can almost feel the dry heat, the parched throats, the hopelessness sinking in. At this point, Hagar reaches her breaking point. She can't bear to watch her son die, so she places Ishmael under a bush and walks away. The Bible tells us that she sat down a bow shot away, meaning she couldn't stand to be near him as he suffered. Can you picture the heartbreak? As a mother, the pain must have been unbearable. She thought it was over. There was no way out of this situation. She had survived once before, but this time, she was sure it was the end. But just as before, God wasn't done with Hagar. In what can only be described as a beautiful twist, God shows up again, right when all hope seems lost. The Bible says that God heard the boy crying. There's that theme again, God hearing the cries of the outcasts, the forgotten, the lost. An angel calls out to Hagar saying, "What's the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." He tells her to lift Ishmael up and promises once again that he will become a great nation. And then in the middle of the desert, Hagar's eyes are opened and she sees a well of water. Can you imagine the relief? It's like being stuck in a desert with no GPS and then suddenly finding a fully stocked water station just around the corner. In that moment, everything changed. God provided exactly what they needed to survive, right when they needed it most. Not a minute too soon, not a second too late. This wasn't just about physical provision, though. It was a symbol of God's care, his promise, his unwavering attention to those who feel abandoned. Here's where the story really hits home. How often do we find ourselves in wilderness moments, times where we feel completely cut off, like we've run out of options and all we can do is sit down and wait for the worst? We've all been there. Maybe it's a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or a period of loneliness that feels like it's never going to end. And just when we think we're at our breaking point, God shows up in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's through a friend's encouragement, a timely opportunity, or a solution we never saw coming. Hagar's story reminds us that God is never far away, even when we feel like we've been sent into the desert. Just when we think there's no hope, no way out, He opens our eyes to the well that's been there all along. It's a beautiful picture of God's provision, not just for the chosen few, but for everyone, even the ones who feel like they're on the outside looking in. This is where we can draw some serious encouragement. Just like God cared for Hagar and Ishmael, He cares for you. No matter how far into the wilderness you've wandered, no matter how desperate or lost you feel, God sees you. He hears you. He hasn't forgotten you. And just like Hagar, you might be closer to that well of water than you think. It's easy to feel like we're too far gone, that we're too far from God's attention. But Hagar's story shows us that God is right there in the wilderness with us. He didn't just drop a map for her to find her way out. He came to her right where she was in her moment of greatest need. And that's the God we serve, a God who meets us in our brokenness, our fear, and our despair, and gives us exactly what we need to keep going. So what's the spiritual takeaway here? It's simple but powerful. God's care extends to everyone, no matter where you are or what you've done. You don't have to be at the center of the story to be important to Him. Whether you feel like Isaac, the one with all the promises, or Ishmael, the one on the outside, God's love and provision are for you too. And even when you find yourself in the wilderness, especially when you're in the wilderness, He's there, providing, caring, and making a way when there seems to be no way. In the end, Hagar and Ishmael didn't just survive the desert, they thrived. Ishmael grew up to become a great nation, just as God had promised. And Hagar? Well, her story became one of hope for all of us who've ever felt abandoned or overlooked. God's provision didn't just come once, it kept coming over and over again, proving that He's not just a God of promises, He's a God of fulfilled promises. So if you're feeling lost, if you're sitting in your own desert right now, take heart. There's a well waiting for you, and God will open your eyes to see it. Just hold on, because He hears you, He sees you, and He's not done with your story yet. That's it, everyone. Hagar's journey through the wilderness has taken us on a powerful path of survival, hope, and God's never-ending provision. What part of her story resonated with you the most? Was it the moment she thought all hope was lost, only for God to open her eyes to the well of water? Or maybe it was the reminder that, like Ishmael, we are all heard by God, even in our most desperate moments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to share them in the comment section below. Hagar's story is one that touches on so many themes: rejection, redemption, and God's incredible care for those who feel cast aside. What did this story teach you about God's character? How do you see yourself in Hagar's experience? Let's continue the conversation, because these aren't just ancient stories. They're stories that apply to our lives today, reminding us that God sees us, even when we feel invisible. If you enjoyed this journey through Hagar's wilderness, and you're hungry for more stories like this, stories of faith, redemption, and God's hand working in unexpected ways, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. There are more incredible biblical stories to explore, and I can't wait to dive into the next one with you. Before we go, I want to leave you with this. Hagar's story is a reminder that no matter how far into the wilderness we wander, God's provision is never out of reach. If you're going through a tough season right now, take heart. There's a well waiting for you, just like there was for Hagar. God hears your cries, and He's already making a way. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey. Until next time, keep seeking, keep trusting, and remember, God sees you, He hears you, and He's not done with your story yet. See you in the next episode.